Hello everyone, it's History Behind the Warrior, and welcome back to another God of War video. Today, with us finally at the end of the Norse series of games, I thought that we could talk about a pivotal figure in not just the Nordic saga, but Norse mythology as a whole. Today's history of video will be on none other than the elder god of the Aesir and Allfather of the Nine Realms, Odin. Now, Odin has been a heavily foreshadowed figure since Kratos' arrival in the Nine Realms, with Midgard scarred in his search for power and a higher plane of reality. So what does lie beyond the realm of the gods? Well, in today's video, we're going to be dialing things extremely far back to understand just who the Allfather is, what impact has he made on the series, and most importantly, what has driven the Allfather insane, as his pursuit for knowledge transcends anything we've seen in the series previously. But with all of that said and noted, here is a quick reminder as always, that if possible everyone, before we kick off, let's first get this video to about 1,000 likes. Again, it's a small thing, mind you, but trust me when I do say it goes a very long way for the channel, especially with YouTube having recently age restricted my history of Kratos. And if you like what we do here and wish to see more, please don't forget to subscribe and tick that bell. Anywho, with all of that out the way, let's get on with the video. Now, to really touch on Odin as a character, we must first go very far back to the dawn of the primordial realms, Muspelheim and Niflheim. You see, Odin and his bloodline derive from two primordials in Norse mythology. The first being Ymir, the very first giant, and Umdambla, the primordial cow. Now, the cow itself is what would more or less give birth to his lineage, having licked a stone, but would later gain shape and sentience. This would be the very first god, Björdi. Now, Björdi would go on to sire a child with a giantess, someone from Ymir's lineage. Thus, their child, Bor, would go on to repeat the cycle, having 3 children with a giantess, the first being Odin, and then the next two being Vili and V. Now, being raised in Gnupgagap, the space in between the primordial realms, the world was not exactly kind to Odin and his brothers, as they were torn between the freezing colds of Niflheim and the scalding heats of Muspelheim. Believing that they were destined for greatness, Odin concocted a sinister plan to create a new world where they would be the overseers of fate. So, with Vili and V by his side, the trio would take on the primordial Ymir. It was a long and arduous fight, but eventually Ymir was slain, and in death, the brothers would take his flesh and bone and then harvest them into the Nine Realms. So a new world would be forged into reality, with Odin branding himself as the Allfather. But despite his incredible achievement, there was something else that was far more intriguing. The cataclysmic battle between Odin and Ymir had ripped open a fracture in reality, one which was a gateway into that of the unknown, with Odin suspecting that this was a world beyond theirs. A higher plane, so to say. With more questions than answers, Odin would become obsessed with what this could not only be, but the possibilities that lay dormant beyond the crack. Thus, he would build the Grand Lodge above the tear. And so begins Odin's obsessive nature with seeking answers from the abyss. And at a later point, this would lead to Odin coming across a mysterious fractured mask, one that radiated the same energy and strength that Tyr did. But despite his incredible mind and knowledge, Odin was unable to decipher the engravings carved into the mask, as it was written in a language he had never seen before. Unfortunately, his quest had little to no success. But that's not to say Odin's entire personality was eclipsed by his hunger for knowledge, as during this time, whilst the other realms formed, Odin was extremely determined to establish the Aesir as the dominant force. So Odin would begin to spread conflict throughout the 9 realms, seeking to let all know just who he and the Aesir were all about. This large-scale assault created many enemies across the 9 realms, with some of the most well-known being the Vanir, a race of gods typically associated with fertility and love, and the giants of Jotunheim. They were descendants of the great giant Ymir, and retained the unique ability to see into the future. But that's not to say that everyone hated the Allfather, as the mortals of Midgard were smitten with the fighting spirit of Odin, seeing him as courageous in his conquests. So mortals would begin to worship him and the rest of the Aesir pantheon, hoping that by doing so, they could be deemed as worthy in his eyes. So, as a reward for his most devoted of followers, Odin would go on to create Valhalla, a heaven of sorts, where the selected worthy could fight for him in death. So shortly after creating this grand hall, he would create 9 angelic figures, the Valkyries, and they would be appointed the job of escorting the dead to Valhalla. As this went underway, Odin sought out ways to expand his family, wishing to create an empire and legacy that could share his strength, values, and thirst for knowledge. The first woman he wished to betroth was a giantess by the name of Skadi. However, upon it being rejected, out of sheer pettiness, Odin would go on to trick the archer into killing her own father that would later lead to her own demise. But Odin's second conquest, at least from what is documented, would actually be a success, finding love in yet another giantess by the name of Fjorgen. The two would go on to marry and later sire his first son, Thor, the god of thunder. And although Odin was a rather hard character to read, he did genuinely seem happy with Fjorgen by his side, infatuated by her love for him. Now, as the years passed by, Odin began to see potential in his son, as he embodied the values and the fighting spirit of the Aesir. So as such, Odin would gift Thor a weapon befitting of his cruelty and bloodlust. The hammer, known as Mjolnir, crafted by the ever-talented Hordra brothers. The hammer was a mastercraft in brutality, ripping and tearing its way throughout the 9 realms. But little did Odin actually know that this plan would backfire. At some point, after the creation of Mjolnir and later Draupnir, Fjorgen would mysteriously die by unknown means, and her death would send Odin into a crippling depression. Now, the clarity of these events can only be described as vague at best, but what is heavily implied is that it was Thor, of all people, who had killed her, as notably during this time, Thor had also gained the reputation of being a giant slayer, so his disdain towards the Jotnar was extremely well known. Now, of course, this is at best labeled as a rumor, but with how Odin has notably treated Thor, it wouldn't surprise me if there was an inkling of truth behind her death, especially seeing as going forward, Odin would go on to sire 2 other sons, that being Tyr, the Aesir god of war, and the all-seeing guardian of the Bifrost, Heimdall. But they weren't the only people to have entered Odin's life, as the Aesir would be approached by a foreign puck by the name of Mimir. Now Mimir, seeking solitude, offered his vast knowledge as a bargaining chip for his safety, and with Odin's endless pursuit of knowledge, he would accept Mimir into his ranks, with Mimir actually offering him to drink from his well of knowledge, allowing him to gain enlightenment. But upon doing so, Odin suffered vivid and horrific hallucinations. So much so that he tried to claw out both of his eyes, only being stopped by Mimir after tearing one out. But once Odin had reclaimed his senses, he realized that there was no greater knowledge. He had, in fact, been tricked by Mimir, having laced the well in a number of different shrooms that were so powerful it could daze even an elder god. Even so, with that knowledge in mind, Odin chose to play along with Mimir's tricks, seeing his knowledge and counsel as something worth his time, but not his trust. As the Aesir continued their war against the Nine Realms, they would surprisingly be approached by a Vanir god, Freya, a deity who had hoped to broker peace between both sides by teaching the Aesir how to seed their crops and fertilize their lands. But Freya's optimism was deeply misplaced, as they only took this opportunity to torture and brutalize Freya, with Odin taking immense pleasure in burning him alive. Freya was able to escape, but the Vanir gods did not take kindly to their unprovoked attack. This would lead to a grand war between both sides. And whilst the Aesir were formidable in their ferocity, they had severely underestimated the Vanir, as their affinity for Sidr magic was second to none. So, with the magic of ancients at their fingertips, they were able to hold their own against Odin's army. But this was a war where no side was actually victorious, because they were so evenly matched. They sent each other over a tipping point. So Mimir and Odin were forced to figure out a plan to settle and end this war, with Odin promising to lay down his arms if, in turn, he could have Freya's hand in marriage. Now, understandably, at first, many in Vanaheim rejected this offer, not wanting to sell out one of their own. But Freya herself saw this as a way to end her people's suffering. So to stop the war, Freya would agree to Odin's offer, and the two would later go on to be married, much to the dismay of Freya and the other Vanir gods. And feeling betrayed, they would shortly exile Freya, thus stranding her to the likes of Asgard. Despite Odin's words of peace, behind her back, Odin actually continued to wage his war on Vanaheim, leaving it a desolate wasteland, and having Freya's sacrifice be in vain. Now, although the foundation of their marriage was shaky at first, Odin really grew to love Freya, and in turn, so would she, as she would later go on to make her his Valkyrie queen, and then have a child together, that being Balder. But the love between the two would shortly crumble after this, as once Odin had learned of Ragnarok and his fated demise at the hands of the Jotnar, the Allfather would become completely infatuated by the prophecy, believing it to be carved in stone. Odin would take every action possible to protect himself and even Asgard, going so far as to have a giant wall built by the giant Hrumthur. But this deal would come at a cost, because if this wall was forged in under 2 years, then the giant could have an audience with Freya. But of course, the Allfather had plans of his own, double-crossing the giant to fall. As time passed by, Odin eventually grew desperate, resorting to any means possible to change his fate. And with the rift still not granting him answers, beings. He even sought out the giants in the hopes of gaining their clairvoyance to control Ragnarok. But of course, the giants refused to give away their secrets, having possibly known about the outcome of Ragnarok themselves. So, out of sheer malice, Odin would have Thor be sent to Midgard and have him wage a bloody siege against any Jotnar remaining there. The world of Midgard would be drenched in Jotnar blood, because if Odin couldn't control destiny, then he damn well may try to prevent such a future from passing. And with the realm of Jotunheim cut off, and the giants scattered, the Allfather did look victorious. But his mad obsession did not stop there, and eventually, it started to take a toll on his marriage, as he saw Freya as more or less a tool, as he repeatedly heckled her to learn Sidra magic, and even wanted to be granted Baldur's immortality spell. But his use of Freya never became more apparent than when Mjolnir was stolen. Acquired by the giant Thrym, he requested for Freya's hand in marriage, something Odin understandably had no interest in. But what he saw here was an opportunity. Using Freya's talents for illusion magic, a spell would be cast on Thor, giving him the appearance of the goddess. But what they hadn't told Freya was that the second Thor arrived in Jotunheim, he would go on to lay forth a bloody massacre, not just against Thrym and his court, but on the rest of Jotunheim. Realizing that she had played a part in her husband's archaic obsession, Freya would pull Thor back to Asgard, and her marriage with Odin would very quickly dissolve, as the Allfather branded her as a traitor in his eyes. To clear his court, Odin would tactically enact his final plan in preparations for Ragnarok, to remove all that he deemed as traitors amongst this table. So Freya would be stripped of her Valkyrie wings, and then cursed to the desolate plain of Midgard. Mimir would be forever prisoned to an unbreakable tree, and even his own son Tyr, an advocate of peace amongst the Jotnar, would be sealed away deep beneath the surface of Asgard. With his worries cast aside, Odin would then focus his gaze on the Emerald Tear, believing that it was the key to ending the eternal cycle. But this was no simple task, as he had to assemble the remaining fragments of the mask. Fragments that he could not find, as he could not read it. So he would seek other ways to control Ragnarok, starting with Skull and Hati. Odin believed that by capturing the wolves, he could then control when Ragnarok began. And then he would turn his sights to the Jotnar Grower, an ancient practitioner of Sidra magic, whose own knowledge exceeded that of Odin's. Now understandably, Odin deemed her as a threat, thus he would kill her and then steal her grand library, as she refused to give away any information as to how Ragnarok would unfold. He would even raid Tyr's vault in the hopes of learning languages from other lands, but still, all roads led to failure, at least in regards to the mask. Thus, Odin would begin to reside deep within the heart of Asgard, looking at other ways to manipulate Ragnarok. But things unraveled in a way that the Allfather had never foreseen. His son and best tracker, Baldur, had fallen to the hands of someone he never foresaw in the prophecy, Olympus's exiled god of war, Kratos. From Odin's knowledge of Ragnarok, he'd estimated that he had about 100 more winters before the apocalypse was at his doorstep. But the death of Baldur had completely altered the prophecy, meaning that war was on the horizon and it was only 3 years away. During this time, Odin would find another way to defy fate, and that would be through Kratos' son, the half-giant Atreus. Having learnt that Atreus was a scholar, someone extremely well versed in articulate knowledge and language, Odin realized that the boy could very well be the key he needed to unlocking the Emerald Rift. So slowly but surely, Odin would begin to plant the seeds of his plan for Atreus to fall into his grasp. And he would do this through the disappearance of Tyr. Knowing how the Jotnar idolized him, Odin would lead Atreus astray from his father under this facade that he could free Tyr, and that with Tyr at their side, he could lead them to victory in the end days of Ragnarok. But of course, this was all simply a ploy to destroy any rebellion from within, with Odin posing as the god of war. But this was no simple task, as Odin had to carefully orchestrate this plan with no one else knowing, not even his family. So once the protective stave around Kratos' home was broken, Thor and Odin would pay them a visit. And here, Odin would address Kratos directly, that despite the bloodshed he had on his hands, he actually had no ill will towards him, simply saying that he wanted peace and an end to Ragnarok. But this deal could only be delivered under one condition: that Atreus stop his hunt for Tyr. To purposely sour this deal, Odin told Kratos that if he accepted, then he would even deal with Freya himself. Understandably, not wanting any harm to come to their former ally, Kratos turned Odin down, much to the Allfather's glee. So as he walks out, he allows Thor off his leash, letting him have some fun with Kratos, whilst he approached Atreus. Now Odin found a form of kinship in the boy's curiosity, and thus offered him an opportunity to come to Asgard when he was ready. So, with the seeds sown, Odin would return back to Asgard, and the damage was done. The secret between father and son would slowly begin to tear them apart, and Odin knew that it was only a matter of time before they followed through on hunting Tyr. So he would lead them astray to Svartalheim, where he would disguise himself as the god of war. So once freed, Odin would effectively play behind the lines, plucking at the wounds between father and son, stitch by stitch. But Odin himself came across an incredible revelation in Alfheim that he never realized. That the Jotnar murals weren't just retellings of events, but in fact gateways that toured the future. And inside Groa's mural, Odin saw Ragnarok unfolding, with the charge being led by an unknown figure, believed by Atreus to be Tyr. Understandably, it couldn't have been Tyr, as Tyr was locked away, so Odin suspects that it must be Atreus that is destined to stop him. So with this knowledge in mind, Odin would continue to sow turmoil between the two, with secrets ultimately being what forced Atreus to leave his father's side and wind up in Asgard. But Odin wasn't anything like Atreus had suspected. He was soft-spoken, polite, and, well, kind. And this threw Atreus off guard, as Odin made it incredibly clear that he knew of Atreus' ulterior motives. To betray him, naturally, and, well, he was fine with it. You see, to Odin, Atreus had nothing else to offer him outside of helping him, as his ultimate goal could only be achieved through their cooperation. So shortly, after offering him a place in Asgard, he would show Atreus the Emerald Tear and the significance behind it. That if they were to work together, then maybe, just maybe, not only could they prevent Ragnarok, but save the ones they loved. Whilst unsure, Atreus believed that in some capacity, Odin's quest was that of a noble one. So for a time, Atreus would trust him, travelling out to the likes of Muspelheim and Niflheim with Thor, Thrud and Heimdall to acquire the remaining fragments of the mask. As this went underway, Odin's frustrations towards Thor would become more and more prevalent, saying that he was better off as a dumb drunk. Whilst subtle, it was very clear from the start of Ragnarok that there was a disconnect between Thor and Odin, with the Allfather deeming his son as boring and even his grandsons as useless. Odin's poor treatment of Thor and saying how he thinks too much may actually be a reason as to why Thor tells Atreus to not think. It helps numb the pain he feels. And this would all reach a boiling point when the final piece of the mask is acquired. When Odin arrives in Niflheim, Thor's wife, Sif, would also appear, much to the surprise of Odin, Atreus, and Thor. Here, she would reprimand the Allfather, objecting against his desires to recruit Atreus, and showing how his own desires had put his own family in danger, even crippling his son emotionally to the bottom of a bottle. But instead of acknowledging her worries, Odin simply sways his hand and dismisses any of her thoughts. Her words did not fall on deaf ears, as Thor did see sense to them, taking aim and striking at Atreus as revenge for killing his sons. But luckily, the young boy is able to slip through their grasp, with the mask in his possession. It wasn't entirely out of Odin's reach. Once Atreus returned back to Sindri's home, Odin saw another opportunity to reclaim the mask. Under the disguise of Tyr, Odin decided to change his tone and offered to lead the assault to Asgard, using a secret path that no one had heard of. So with a plan in place, things looked like they were steering in Odin's favor. Having been at odds with the imposter since his very arrival, Brock instantly sensed that something wasn't right. As Tyr suddenly referred to Atreus as Loki, he had suddenly changed his stance on war, and he had this secret path to Asgard that he hadn't mentioned previously. Brock could tell Odin was lying through his teeth. Odin had finally reached his boiling point. At his own wit's end, he would pull out a knife and jam it into Brock's chest, before then taking hold of Atreus and holding a knife to his throat, wanting the mask in exchange for his freedom. Luckily, the crafty nature of Freya was able to force Odin out of Sindri's home, but the damage had been done, and Brock lay dead in the hands of his brother. War against Asgard had finally begun. The next time we do see Odin is during the siege of Asgard, where after his walls are crumbled and Thor is defeated, he bears witness to his son defying his orders, choosing to follow the words of Kratos instead of that of his own. And this does nothing but piss off the Allfather. Seeing no use for a defective weapon, Odin would kill his son with Gungnir. But what he didn't realize was his granddaughter Thrud bearing witness to it, someone who idolized her grandfather. And the silver-tongued snake couldn't worm his way out of this one. So after casting her aside with Mjolnir, the Allfather would do battle with Kratos and Atreus, with Atreus understandably disgusted at Odin for killing his own son. Before he could be stopped, the Allfather is able to cast an incantation that immobilizes Kratos and Atreus. Reveling in his supposed victory, he prepares to strike them down, but his breath is caught short as he feels a grip tightening around his throat. And this is where he is reunited with Freya. As you see earlier on, Freya had acquired the noose that the Allfather used to gain greater knowledge from the World Tree. With it now in her possession, she was able to bind it with a curse that was slowly choking out the Allfather. Before she can finish him, Odin is able to crumble the ground beneath their feet, falling into his chambers near the Emerald Tear. With Atreus and the mask before him, Odin tries to manipulate Atreus one final time, laying down his weapons and encouraging him to wear the mask, to give him the answers that he has spent lifetimes searching for. After seeing him kill his son, turn on his granddaughter, and use mortals as meat shields, Atreus now truly sees him for the monster he is, and snaps the mask in half, crushing any dreams and revelations the All-Father was looking for. Beyond enraged, Odin would cast every spell and every incantation on Kratos, Freya, and Atreus, wanting them to suffer for denying him his destiny. In the end, Odin was blinded by his own deceit, defeated by the trio, and falling to the hand of Atreus. In one final-ditch effort, Atreus does try to appeal to his better side, to have him see that his actions have consequences, but Odin rejects any responsibility, proclaiming that he would never change, and that he was above consequence. And with a heavy heart, Atreus is forced to cast a spell on him, one that pulls his soul from his body and instills it within a small Jotnar marble. With the All-Father defeated, the trio then discuss what they should do with Odin, as the All-Father was defeated, and not even Freya herself wished to take his life. Sindri, on the other hand, was not quite so forgiving. Having not forgotten what Odin did to Brock, he would take the marble and then smash it with Brock's own hammer, shattering the All-Father into dust and echoes. And so marks the end of Odin. Now this was both an interesting and very compact episode, as there was simply just so much to cover. But Odin in the God of War universe is a very intriguing character. He is, by all intents and purposes, a manipulative, self-destructive, compulsive liar. A man so heavily built on his throne of deceit that he is unable to tell the difference between a truth and a lie. As throughout the game, you actually realize that Odin would make lies over even the smallest of things. And this is scary in so many ways, as it seems like even he himself believes that his own nature of deceit allows him to speak a new reality into being, which is why I also believe he had been pursuing the mask. Every person, every life, and every deity is simply a pawn on his chessboard, a piece that the All-Father has calculated in moving, willing to sacrifice it if it is to his own benefit. His marriage to Freya, a simple way to learn Seeder magic. His marriage to other women, a way to sire his own children of war. His interest in Loki, a simple means to an end to achieve his ultimate goal. Do not let his kind demeanor sway you, as whilst it's very clear he is capable of being kind and loving, he is the devil, and the greatest thing the devil ever did was make you believe he didn't exist. With that said, everyone, this has been it for the history of Odin. I hope you have enjoyed this one, and wow! This was a pretty big episode, so sorry for only one upload this week. But from what you can tell, this did take a while to put together. So, with everything covered here, what did you think of Odin? Did you like how they portrayed the king of Asgard? And what did you think of the Tyr plot twist? Please do comments down below, as I'd love to hear what you have to say. But for now, everyone, as always, stay strong, stay well, and keep on fighting, as Ragnarok is finally here. Take care, everyone. I'll see you soon.